The UK, along with the rest of the world, are still adjusting to saying King Charles when referring to the reigning British monarch. Following Queen Elizabeth II's 70 years on the throne, adapting to a new king may take some time. And while King Charles is certainly no stranger to the public, how the monarchy will look under his guidance is still unknown. Will he embrace a turn toward modernity as desired by his sons and much of the British population, or will he continue a legacy of traditional values established during his mother's long reign? In the case of Charles III, he's likely hoping that history won't repeat itself, as the reigns of the previous King Charles are probably not ones he wishes to emulate. The first King Charles was born in Dunfermline Palace in 1600, the second son of King James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and a great-great-grandson of Henry VII, King of England and Lord of Ireland, making Charles, dear papa, a potential heir to all three thrones. Indeed, James became King of Scotland aged 13 months after his mother was forced to abdicate. And when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603 without leaving an heir, Charles' father succeeded her, becoming King James I of England and Ireland. Thus, Charles grew up as the child of a ruler of three kingdoms. That didn't mean his life was easy. Charles suffered from poor health, had difficulty walking, spoke with a stammer, and was overshadowed in every sense of the word by his older brother, Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales. Henry was the heir apparent, a strapping young man exemplifying all the qualities of a future monarch. Charles was the spare, resigned to a life of lonely privilege. That is until the Prince of Wales fell ill and died suddenly, pushing stumbling Charles to the front of the line of succession. King James I was not an easy act to follow. Under his rule, the golden age of Elizabethan literature continued to flourish into his Jacobean age, giving life to writers like William Shakespeare and Francis Bacon. James himself was a prolific writer, authoring multiple best-selling works and sponsoring a translation of the Bible into English that would later be named after him. He was also a serious and thoughtful monarch who was committed to a peace policy and determined to avoid any unnecessary involvement in religious wars. At the same time, however, he was a proponent of witch trials and oversaw the torture of those accused. Before his death, James had been working hard to ensure a match between Charles and Maria Anna of Spain, to ensure diplomatic peace between the countries. But Parliament was openly hostile towards Spain and Catholicism, and Maria wasn't much interested in the marriage proposal either. Spain demanded that, should a match go forward, Charles must convert to Roman Catholicism, repeal English penal laws that punished Catholics in England, and remain in Spain for at least a year following the wedding to ensure his compliance with their terms. Charles returned from Spain without a bride, and James declared war on the country before promptly falling ill and dying. Now a newly crowned king, Charles was in desperate need of a wife. Having flubbed the Spanish match, he turned to France instead. On May 1st, 1625, Charles was married by proxy to 15-year-old Princess Henrietta Maria. A proxy marriage is one in which one or both individuals are not physically present. The newlyweds would meet a month later, with Charles bringing his queen home to a parliament and public who were less than welcoming to her. As with Maria, Henrietta was a Catholic in a place and time where Catholicism was widely frowned upon, to say the least. The new king attempted to smooth things over with a promise to Parliament that he would not relax religious restrictions, but he had in fact agreed to do just that in a secret marriage treaty with his brother-in-law, Louis XIII of France. Charles' lack of transparency was one of the reasons he was so openly despised by Parliament. His relationship with George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, was also widely criticised, leading some to believe that the king's favourite had far too much influence. Villiers wasn't a problem for long, however, as he was assassinated in 1628, to much rejoicing from the public and much despair and grief from Charles. Villiers was one of the main proponents of the war with Spain, and his death effectively brought it to an end. But Charles' problems were far from over.
The new king would clash with Parliament throughout his reign. He was a devoutly religious man who had inherited from his father the unyielding belief that God had intended kings to rule, and as such was disinclined to explain any of his policies.
Charles needed Parliament to collect the taxes he needed to wage his war with Spain, so an uneasy peace would often be reached. This would change in March 1629. With growing opposition to his taxation practices, Charles had ordered Parliament be adjourned. But 3 members prolonged the session by holding the Speaker, Sir John Finch, down in his chair. This gave them enough time to rush through several resolutions. This enraged the king, who had Parliament dissolved and 9 members imprisoned. This period of personal rule came to be known as the 11 Years' Tyranny, but was technically within the king's prerogative, if widely disliked. Without a parliament to levy taxes, Charles was forced to look elsewhere for funding. The solutions he found were nearly universally unpopular. He resurrected an old law unused for over 100 years called the Distraint of Knighthood, which required any man who earned £40 or more from his land each year to present himself at the king's coronation to be knighted. Charles extracted fines from any such man who had failed to attend his coronation years before. But even more despised was his imposition of a feudal levy called ship money, which was typically assessed on populations of coastal areas in England during wartime for naval defence. Charles extended the tax to all counties in England, collecting over £150,000 annually from his subjects through its use. Ironically, these years in which Charles was fueling a growing rage within his kingdom were the happiest of his life. Following the assassination of George Villiers, he turned to his wife for comfort and counsel and did something few monarchs rarely did. He fell in love with her. The couple had 9 children together, but only 4 lived to adulthood. Among them, the future King Charles II. While Charles may have grown to be loved by his wife, this was not the case with his ancestral homeland of Scotland. His attempt to impose a high church liturgy and prayer book there had prompted a riot in Edinburgh, which escalated into widespread anger and eventually all-out war. The king was forced to reconvene Parliament to raise funds for his war with Scotland. But in doing so, he opened up himself and his advisers to criticism from the House of Commons. He made concessions to Parliament, including accepting bills that declared ship money and other arbitrary financial measures illegal. But while attempting to buoy relationships with Parliament to address the upheavals in Scotland, Charles learned of antagonisms in Ireland, an uprising against the English and Scottish Protestant settlers in Ulster that only spread anti-Catholic sentiment more rapidly through Charles' kingdom. Fearful for his Catholic queen, he took desperate action. He ordered the arrest of 5 members of Parliament for treason. The men escaped capture, but the incident incited civil war. Charles had effectively severed England in 2. The Roundheads supporting Parliament, the Cavaliers supporting the monarchy. The king fled London for Oxford, where he raised an army and set off for war. The 2 sides seemed evenly matched for years, resulting in a frustrating stalemate until the 1645 Battle of Naseby, where royalist forces were effectively crushed. The following year, Charles was captured and handed over to the English Parliament by the Scots. It didn't have to mean the end for Charles, but he subsequently refused demands for a constitutional monarchy, attempted escape, and continued plotting a revolt. By 1649, he was on trial for treason in Westminster Hall. He stood accused of using his power to pursue his personal interest rather than the good of the country. The indictment also held him guilty of all treason, murder, and other damaging and dangerous crimes that occurred during his civil war, which had killed nearly 6% of the country's population. During his trial, Charles repeated insistently that no court had jurisdiction over a monarch and that his authority to rule had been granted by God, making the trial itself illegal. In response, the court challenged the doctrine of sovereign immunity by claiming the law protected the office of the king, not the person. After 5 days of hearings, King Charles I was found guilty and sentenced to death. Charles' execution was scheduled for January the 30th, 1649. He was permitted to say goodbye to 2 of his children, who remained in England under the control of Parliament. On the morning of his execution, the king asked to be dressed in 2 shirts, not wanting any shivering from cold to be mistaken by the crowd for shivers of fear. At 2 p.m., Charles placed his head on a block in front of the Palace of Whitehall. He was beheaded with 1 clean stroke. Because his body was not allowed to be buried at Westminster Abbey, it was taken to Windsor instead and was buried in private in the chapel there. The moment his father's life ended, things got significantly worse for Charles II, who was just 18 years old at the time. For most of his childhood, Charles II had moved from one hiding spot to the next, from Falmouth to the Isles of Scilly to Jersey, and finally to France, where his mother was living under the protection of her cousin, 8-year-old King Louis XIV. Barely a man himself, Charles II spent the last years of his father's life trying desperately to save him. He moved to The Hague in 1648, hoping to convince his sister Mary and brother-in-law William II, Prince of Orange, to aid the royalist cause. Whilst there, Charles fathered the first of his many illegitimate children. Despite his diplomatic efforts to save the king, Charles II learned of his father's execution while in the Netherlands. While many parliamentarians celebrated the downfall of the monarchy, the Scots were horrified by the execution. They proclaimed Charles II king and invited him to Scotland. Returning to England to claim his father's throne was an impossibility. Oliver Cromwell, who had just signed his father's death warrant, dominated the newly established Commonwealth of England. Scotland was willing to welcome the second Charles, but only if he agreed to establish Presbyterianism as the state religion in all 3 of his kingdoms. He wasn't keen on this, and so sent Scottish nobleman Lord Montrose along with a small army to threaten the Scots with invasion. The force was initially tasked with landing on the Orkney Islands. Lord Montrose decided to take the situation into his own hands and initiated the invasion by landing his army on the mainland. After his execution, Charles grudgingly agreed with the terms and was coronated in Scotland, which further alienated him from would-be supporters in England. While the newly crowned king was busy signing the National Covenant in Scotland, Oliver Cromwell was leading a brutal campaign through Ireland to eliminate support for the exiled ruler there. He massacred Catholics under the justification that such slaughter would encourage rapid surrender. He also continued the practice of settling Protestants on confiscated Irish land, a policy that cemented England's dominance there and infuriated the Catholics. Next, he turned his attention to Scotland, achieving a brilliant victory in the Battle of Dunbar and crushing Charles II's hopes at the Battle of Worcester. Scottish resistance was nearly entirely wiped out, and the English government announced that the 2 countries would henceforth be one Commonwealth. Charles was forced to flee, becoming a fugitive in England before escaping to France for the 2nd time in 1651. During his escape, it's said he evaded capture by hiding in an oak tree. This would become known as the Royal Oak, with many pubs later adopting the name. In France, Charles lived in luxury. He stayed in Saint-Germain-en-Laye and was granted an allowance from Louis XIV, quickly establishing a solid reputation for indulgence, exuberance, and taking pleasure wherever he might find it. But despite his comfortable lifestyle, Charles was deprived of the one thing he wanted most: to mount a challenge to Cromwell's government, which was by then virtually a military dictatorship. Despite his familial connections to the Netherlands and France, both allied themselves with Cromwell, forcing Charles to leave Paris and turn to Spain for aid. He brokered the Treaty of Brussels in 1656, gathering Spanish support for a restoration in return for contributions to their war against France. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, but Charles' chances of regaining his crown still seemed slim. Cromwell's son, Richard, succeeded his father as Lord Protector, but Richard lacked the military genius and political ambition of his father and resigned a year later. Instead of descending into anarchy, Britain elected a House of Commons that was evenly divided between royalists and parliamentarians. This new Convention Parliament invited Charles to London to reclaim his throne with the Declaration of Breda. He agreed to rule with lenience and tolerance, promising not to exile past enemies, confiscate wealth, or exact unnecessary punishment on parliamentarians. His promise did not extend to those directly responsible for his father's death. Within his first months as monarch, 9 regicides were hanged, drawn, and quartered, while another 40 were given life imprisonment or excluded from office for life. Oliver Cromwell's corpse was exhumed from Westminster Abbey and subjected to a posthumous execution, first gibbeted and then thrown into a pit. His head was cut off and displayed on a pole outside Westminster Hall for the next 23 years.
The Convention Parliament, the Parliament that had invited Charles back to England, had been dissolved, and the second Parliament of Charles' reign, the Cavalier Parliament, assembled.
While Charles desired to extend religious tolerance to nonconformists and Catholics, Parliament passed several acts to ensure Anglican dominance that became known as the Clarendon Code. These measures were drastically exclusionary and would be remembered by history as some of the UK's most radical penal laws. Although Charles II was not able to secure the religious tolerance he desired, his reign did restore many of the basic pleasures the Puritan Oliver Cromwell had banned: theatre, sports, swearing, makeup, colourful clothing, and even Christmas celebrations. Charles also did much to promote the advancement of science in his kingdom. He established the Royal Society in London, which became the home of minds like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Edmund Halley. He also founded the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and spent time conducting experiments in his own laboratory. But the early years of Charles' reign were not all laughs and alchemy. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed an estimated 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of London's population, in just 18 months. King Charles and his court fled London in July, leaving behind the aldermen and other city authorities to attempt to control the spread of disease. Their attempts were futile. They never discovered the cause of the disease, couldn't keep up with burials, and likely extended the plague by ordering a cull of dogs and cats, which allowed rats, the largest carriers, to swell in population. Death rates in September reached above 7,000 a week, and anyone who could manage to flee the city did so in droves. It wasn't until the winter of 1666 that the spread eased, allowing the king and his entourage to return to the city in February. Cases continued sporadically throughout the year, but in September, the king's attention was drawn elsewhere. On Saturday, September the 2nd, a fire that started in a bakery on Pudding Lane quickly spread throughout the surrounding areas thanks to warehouses full of timber, rope, oil, and a strong easterly wind. Samuel Pepys, Secretary to the Navy, walked to the Tower of London the following morning to assess the situation. After all, fires were extremely common in the narrow streets and timber-framed houses, but when he saw the extent of the conflagration, he rushed to Westminster to report to Charles, who was entirely ignorant of the fire, since a bend on the Thames blocked his view of the city. While many probably expected Charles to respond much as he did to the plague by fleeing, he surprised his critics by immediately jumping into action to save as much of the city as possible. London was without a fire brigade in 1666, so the work of controlling the blaze fell to soldiers and citizens. The king hurried towards the fire, gathering a crowd of refugees to provide him with details on the situation as he stood less than 100 meters from the flames. He quickly assembled a committee to organize the soldiers and volunteers into fire posts throughout the city. Charles ordered the makeshift crew to pull down as many houses as they could, then changed tactics and allowed them to demolish the houses with gunpowder to expedite the process. He rode for more than 30 hours without a break, demanding food from the Navy stores be brought to feed the homeless and destitute, organizing makeshift camps and setting up a relief fund. The fire burned for days before finally being extinguished on September the 6th.
Around 400 acres of London lay in ruins. Some 13,000 houses and 87 churches were destroyed, along with thousands of other buildings.
King Charles assembled a Privy Council committee and frequently attended their meetings to review plans for rebuilding the city. He had visited many other large cities during his time in exile and contributed a great deal to the planning by sharing his accounts. His vision for a new London included interconnecting straight thoroughfares and houses built of stone and brick instead of timber. Charles' enthusiasm was unquestionable, but his funds were limited. By the end of 1667, only 150 new houses had been built. The rebuilding was slow work, and the results were less architecturally dramatic than Charles had likely been hoping, with emphasis placed instead on planning layouts, drawing up new regulations, laying new sewers, and improving quaysides. In the end, it took nearly 50 years to rebuild the burnt area, and St. Paul's Cathedral was not completed until 1711. But Londoners who had watched Charles ride into the flames with their own eyes knew their king had done everything he could. In 1674, Charles was presented with the Freedom of the City of London, the first reigning monarch to be honoured in such a way.
The king had proven himself to be more than his reputation for debauchery and philandering, but he was nonetheless not without fault.
The king had married a Catholic queen, Catherine of Braganza, and his mother, a favourite sister, and brother, James, were all acknowledged Catholics too. And as the royal marriage failed to produce an heir year after year, Parliament feared the throne might pass to someone of this faith. Tensions came to a head when Charles was forced to agree to a Test Act in 1673 that excluded all Roman Catholics from public office, and Parliament was thwarted by the king 3 times in their attempts to pass an exclusion bill that would bar his brother James, the Duke of York, from the crown. I guess Dukes of York have just never been popular people. The hoax Popish plot that warned of a Catholic rebellion to put James on the throne and resulted in the execution of 35 Catholics, and the very real Rye House plot to murder Charles and crown his illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, further fanned the flames of religious tension. Behind the scenes, Charles had struck a secret deal with France, promising to openly declare himself Catholic and impose his will on his country in exchange for funding for war and to build up England's maritime and trade supremacy. 2 treaties showing the arrangement told 2 different stories. The first, drafted with the French, and the second, delivered to Parliament's Protestant ministers, omitted all references to Charles' conversion to Catholicism. The king managed to dissemble Parliament before the secret leaked and passed the blame for the unpopular Dutch war onto his advisors. Charles ruled the final years of his reign with no Parliament, succumbing to a stroke on February the 6th, 1685, when he was 54 years old. He publicly converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. Charles left behind no legitimate heir and a controversial legacy. Critics claim he was unprincipled and prepared to sell his country and religion to the highest bidder, but his admirers point out what little choice he had. His father's outspoken principles had resulted in a beheading, and his successor, the Catholic James II, would be ousted in the Glorious Revolution. His role in the Restoration and reputation as a fun-seeker earned him the nickname the Merry Monarch, and most historians can agree that in the long arc of British royalty, he was neither an excessively good nor bad ruler. Much has happened in the 3.5 centuries that have passed between the rule of King Charles II and III. It's quite likely King Charles III will not face a public beheading, and he won't have the power to rule without Parliament. But he did take the throne in the midst of a pandemic. He does face tension with the government, and he certainly has his own notorious reputation of life before kinghood to contend with.
So, perhaps there are lessons he can learn from his predecessors after all.
Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.